Thank you, Mrs. Behrens, and thank you, Menno Fitzky. So, hello, everyone. My name is Saskia Goldschmid, and I am a student of the section of East Asian Art History at the University of Zurich in Switzerland. And so, first of all, I would like to take this opportunity and thank everyone at the Heinz Kempfer Fund and the organizers of today's event for giving me the opportunity to actually speak to you today about my master thesis, which is entitled Shadows of Perception, Envisioning Blindness in Edo Period Visual Culture. And as you've already seen it, as the title suggests, my thesis focused on the depiction of blindness and visual impairment in the visual culture of mainly Edo period Japan, with a specific focus on woodblock printed examples and painted examples of this phenomenon. So I first came across this topic as I walked through a Japanese print exhibition with an acquaintance of mine. And as we looked at the prints, he asked me whether people with disabilities were also featured in shunga in particular, but also in other kinds of woodblock prints, to which I was actually quite unsure. And so at this point, I had already come across depictions of conditions such as measles or leprosy, but examples of disabilities, particularly in shunga, I knew nothing of. And so I became curious myself, and I asked our professor at the time, Hans Bjarne Thomsen, who also became my advisor and truly my biggest supporter, about this question. And through his answer, where he mentioned that there might be possible depictions of blind people, I became aware of not only the highly interesting story of blind people in Japan, but also of the fact that once one is aware of their presence and starts looking, images of blind people can be found in many different media and time periods throughout Japan. And so I began researching, and I realized another thing, and that is that the topic of blind people and their lives during the Edo period, this has been the focus of a few recent publications in the field of Japanese history and musicology. One major contributor would be Gerald Bremer, whose book you can see here, the Goze book, whose many publications have also helped me tremendously in understanding the historical context that the images that I looked at were situated in. Additionally, I also saw that art historians have started to engage in interdisciplinary studies that research representations of disability in the arts of different cultures, with many notable publications having been published only recently. Despite the emergence of a greater interest in the representation of disability in art, however, very little has been written about the representation of blindness and visual impairment about the people of the arts of Japan. And the only texts that I could find that directly engage with this topic from an art historical perspective were actually published in Andon, being William Green's Darkness and the Sound of Music, Blind Musicians of Tokugawa Japan Seen in Ukiyo-e, and Helmut Wilmes's The Blind as Metaphorical Subjects in the Pictorial Arts of Japan, published in 2001 and 2002 respectively. So what makes the history of visually impaired people in Edo period Japan so intriguing is that since medieval times, blind men excelled in the realm of music, particularly in connection to the recitation of Heike Monogatari, a piece which became almost exclusively tied to blind men who accompanied themselves on a lute known as the biwa. During the Edo period, then, they expanded their musical repertoire and their vocational possibilities by asserting their skills in the medical field through the practice of anma, so Japanese traditional massage, or acupuncture. These occupations were regulated under a professional guild for the blind known as the Todoza, who throughout the 17th and 18th century also gained significant influence by establishing a favorable relationship with the shogunal government. The guild would also gain quite a notorious reputation due to their dabbling in the business of money lending. However, the success of blind people in regard to the musical field was not limited to men, as blind women were also active as musicians known as goze. Often leading an itinerant lifestyle, they traveled around the countryside and provided entertainment to the rural populace through their songs. These blind men and women, with their unique appearance and presence on the highways of Edo, notably left their marks on Japanese culture, seen in their inclusion in a variety of poems, literature, and their representation in visual culture. So the last two slides have shown some early examples of that. The unique relationship between occupation, status, and disability that became part of the experience of blindness then raises the question, of course, of how blind musicians and acupuncturists were perceived by society and how said societal attitudes impacted the creation of blind individuals as visual representation in popular culture. Therefore, my thesis aimed to analyze and contextualize the representation of blind people during the quite long time span between the, I would say, late-ish Edo period and early Meiji period. What I wanted to show is that blind individuals are found in a variety of settings, revealing the symbolic meanings ascribed to blindness, as well as the unique social standings that could be attained through occupational possibilities solely reserved for blind individuals, people who identified as being blind. In consequence, blindness provided the visually impaired with a social identity that was distinct from that of individuals with other disabilities, but at the same time also impossible to inhabit for the able-bodied. In my thesis statement, I argued that such dichotomy is reflected within the visual arts, as well as sighted artists primarily represented blind figures through these unique occupational avenues. Consequently, blindness as an occupational identity became inextricably tied to the portrayal of visual impairment in the arts. Although this artistic interpretation of blindness by sighted artists would therefore continuously retain certain aspects of stigmatization targeted at both blindness as a condition as well as a social identity, visual impaired individuals gained heightened visibility and new modes of representation in the arts through their occupational status. So in my exploration of the thesis statement, I decided to construct 3 sections. First, I wanted to offer the necessary context to conduct a visual analysis. Therefore, I built a framework based on important concepts of disability studies, which for me also meant a discussion and an engagement with what disability actually is and how scholars have approached that term. I also discussed the language of visual impairment and the problems surrounding the association that the word blindness calls forth both in the English language and also in the Japanese language, which we see in the kanji for mekura, for blind. Next, I also wanted to provide the necessary historical context, including what religious or folkloristic myths and beliefs existed in Japan about disability in general and blindness in particular, and what the possible causes of severe visual impairment were. What then followed was a gendered exploration of the specific professions, how they came to be, and what is known about their hierarchical structures and their positions in society. And then finally followed the core visual analysis, which aimed to identify the different pictorial themes associated with visual impairment. And so after the closer inspections of the visual markers that artists repeatedly use in their representation of blind figures, I divided the material into 2 categories. Images where a symbolic expression of blindness is at the center of representation, and images which are framed by social settings. By situating, however, blindness within the pictorial spheres first, so how do we actually depict blind people, I defined the important parameters inherent in the depiction of blind individuals, the main takeaway being that it is the combination of impaired eyes and the occupational markers such as instruments, shaven pates for men, canes, and certain clothing, and those things are quintessential for the identification of a figure as blind. As these particular examples by Nishikawa Skinobu and Katsushika Hokusai illustrate, the idea of impaired eyes also evolved and diversified substantially over time, so from these closed eyes to kind of different kinds of ailments. So then about symbolical blindness. So what I saw is that the idea of symbolical blindness is often rooted, of course, in Buddhist beliefs and iterations. However, their illumination and allegorical use of blindness in the image is strikingly varied, as is the way in which different artists were able to use the same pictorial motive to express divergent reasoning. This is especially evident in the motive of blind man crossing a log bridge, which was discussed through examples of painters such as Hakuin Ekaku, who probably has the most famous example of such a type, or also anonymous depictions after Tanke Gessen, where blindness was used both as a symbol for spiritual inhibition and as a metaphor for a universal state of being that is subject to relativity, and thus, in some cases, might even be seen as bringing forth beneficial qualities. When the theme is then taken up by ukiyo artists such as Utagawa Toyokuni, its humoristic and linguistic potential is added as another layer of meaning that is meant to entice the viewer to contemplate the connection between text and image. Although these images have maybe nothing to do with blind occupation at first glance, the figures are still based on the changing appearance of contemporary blind individuals. Thus, the symbolic and the real, the hypothetical and the practical become tied into a complex web of blind representation. Next, an exploration of images where blind people are imagined as part of a variety of social interactions or social settings shifted the focus towards the image as a mirror for contemporary societal attitudes towards impairment and occupational blindness. There are many, many fascinating examples of this, from their inclusion in print series of the Tokaido and the Kisokaido to Shunga, I'm sorry for the explicit images, where only one part is usually part of this sexual encounter, and then satire prints that show blind men engaged in brawls. But what I found particularly interesting to look at was the inclusion of the goze, so blind female musicians, in esugoroku, which are woodblock printed game boards, and the style of the play of this game is similar to the game of snakes and ladders. In the particular version of Sugoroku where goze are featured, players go through the fictional life of a woman and attempt to reach the ending of a happy retirement here at the top. While the inclusion of the goze as a type of woman attests to their visibility in society through the negative position given to her in this fictional life, so when the player actually lands on her square, he has to go back and start over again, their womanhood is also marked as deviant. Then in the last section, which was also quite large, I focused on prints and paintings of the two major theater traditions, Nogaku and Kabuki, to see how theatrical stories engage with the theme of blindness and how this is then translated into these examples, printed examples, but also painted examples. How the actor who plays a blind character, for example, here the actor as Asagao, how that differs in the representation in comparison to figures that were modeled after actual blind people was one of the aspects that intrigued me. So this was just a short overview of what I did, and I think in my conclusion, the thesis has explored the multifaceted depictions of blindness in Edo period Japan. Through a detailed analysis of woodblock prints and paintings, I attempted to highlight how blind individuals were artistically represented through their unique occupational identities and how these shaped this representation in turn. As products of sighted artists, these representation may or may not offer a glimpse into the social perceptions surrounding visual impairment. By examining the intersection of disability, occupation, and visual representation, my research also maybe underscores that blindness in Edo period Japan was not merely a condition, but maybe that it could also be considered a complex social identity. And this identity, while clearly stigmatized and absolutely constraining, also provided visually impaired individuals with distinct vocational avenues and visibility in popular culture. Ultimately, my aim was to contribute to a broader understanding of how disability has been perceived and depicted across cultures and eras, inviting further scholarly inquiry into the representations of marginalized groups in art history. As for the As for the artistic representation of blindness in Japan, I can actually still think of many topics that I have not even touched upon. For example, in the media of photography and film, those two also seem very promising avenues for further research, in my opinion. And with that, I would like to end my short presentation, and I thank you all very much for your attention.